Morning, everybody. Hope everyone had a great Christmas. I spent a lot of time with my wife, which to me is the greatest gift I could ask for. Today we're going to talk about what killed jazz. Who killed jazz? Why did jazz die? It's an interesting and very open for debate topic. A lot of people are going to have 2 cents to share. A lot of people are going to say it's not dead, but I got my reasons for saying that it is. And whatever's happening today is a replication, a tribute to. You can still write a play in the ideology of Shakespeare, but it's not Shakespeare. You can't add canon to the Bible nowadays. It had a special power for quite a long stretch of time. We're going to start off with a very weird record, Marty Peisch. And it's only weird because it doesn't really fit into what I'm talking about. But in a way, this record does illustrate part of what was wrong with jazz. As great as this little record is on G&P, a little 10-inch, it's got the red little 10-inch vinyl down there. It does illustrate part of what was wrong with jazz at this point. It had become so white. It had become so dominated by a lot of fantastic white musicians. And there's always a certain element, especially in the young black community, that wants to have something that's going to be theirs. And once white assimilate it too much and start to actually make more money with it than we are, let's make something new and maybe even a little bit blacker that they're going to have a tougher time taking and making their own. And that movement has always been a part of the black mentality. And I'm sure some of it's subliminal and subconscious. It's just like, we got too many white people dancing to this stuff now. We need something on our own that we can identify with. And I think it's a pretty natural thing, especially when you feel oppressed. It's kind of like the angst of punk rock and heavy metal. I'm an outsider. I don't feel like I belong to that larger community that's taken my art, my music, my dance, and so we must kind of create our own new variation of it that's hopefully even a little bit blacker. So they're going to have a tougher time grafting it into their own needs. And watching during the swing era, the end of the swing era, during the war years, how many white musicians were making a living at jazz compared to black? And all you have to do is go to any online Discogs record seller, preferably one with 10,000 plus albums for sale. Google jazz, go to the timeline parameter, Google it from 1950 to 1970, and then just search jazz, vinyl, and that time frame, and look how little black artists are in that, and how the black artist stuff is always more expensive, 10 times harder, 90% harder to find. It's filled with all these white, many of them great players, but a lot of it's very schlocky and shticky and made for kind of middle-class white America on the major labels. But it's very much borrowing that black sound, because no matter how we want to paint it or portray it, the allure of that cool, we always wanted to graph some of what black people are listening to as a kind of validation of how hip I am. The music was always very cool and swinging and funky and had a sexuality to it, so it always drew people into it. But there's still to this day a kind of large chunk of white America that loves listening to what black people are doing, no matter how much it's supposed to exclude that white experience. It's white people who buy it in droves. And by the war, Second World War, by end of the swing era, there was all these white bands working in every town, every Hollywood studio, every television network had all these great white orchestras and bands. And black guys were struggling trying to pay bills and make a living, get work. And they started doing bebop behind the scenes. Parker, Monk, Max Roach, Dizzy Gillespie, all these characters Fats Navarro, Howard McGee, they started playing bebop. And it was complicated. It wasn't super danceable. It was a kind of F you to the commercial shtick I have to play from 7 to 10:30 every night. We're going to go to the bar here at 2 o'clock, play till 6 a.m., and play something that's a little bit more challenging and stimulating. Sadly, that development in jazz coincides with the death of jazz. Because as the black listener goes, so does what's cool. And the black listener didn't really follow bebop. And it's important to remember that the industry is so driven by white consumers. And blacks bought records during the 78 eras, during the Depression, but it's in minuscule numbers compared to what the white consumers do. And so it's even more shocking when a label like Blue Note comes along and says, let's try to make black jazz records for black people. Because that wasn't a very smart business model. It's turned out to be in posterity, but at the time, that was, what are you thinking? So the white consumer is always going to follow what the hip, young black crowds are doing. And there's just this transition as the LP era dawns. And one of the things that is really kind of shocking is that almost the entire golden era from 50 to 1970 of what we think of as the great body of the jazz canon, the modern, the post-bop, the hard bop, the modal, the avant-garde, that entire 20 years is happening as jazz is withering and dying. And if you look, I saw this recent graph that illustrated what was selling genre-wise, I think it was globally, and how jazz dominates the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. It's a huge chunk of the marketplace. And by 1950, it's already descended into a minuscule part. And by 1960, it no longer even shows up high enough to make these graphs. Jazz is gone. It's flatlined. It's dead. And in spite of there being very good selling records, those records don't make up enough for the hundreds of great selling records that sold 5 times what Kind of Blue did at RCA, at Capitol, at Columbia. All these great labels have dozens of records every year that sell millions of copies across infinite different sounds. And the odd jazz record would sell 100,000, and that was considered, wow, that was a great comeback for jazz. And jazz does have certain moments where it grafts back on to the mainstream, but they're fleeting, very, very temporary. They certainly don't make a lot of headway. So in spite of this great record here on G&P being a wonderful little 10-inch with Bob Cooper, Joe Mondragon, Jack DeLong, Conte Condoli, Bob Envelson, Art Mardigan, some great players on the West Coast here on this little Gene Norman Presents 10-inch. But it's these black guys saying, you know, these guys are making all the money, getting all the gigs, doing all the films and television, and we don't even enjoy playing the schlock we have to play at the theaters and concert halls for these big bands. And we think of the swing era as being Count Basie and Duke Ellington and, of course, Benny Goodman. But black people just didn't relate to Frank Sinatra and the Dorsey Brothers. They just didn't. It wasn't their music anymore. And I don't think very many black youth or even 20, 30-somethings went out and bought Tommy Dorsey records. Count Basie is probably the one artist that sold pretty well in the black community through the 40s and 50s. But when you look at the charts, the jazz charts don't exist at that point. And what does exist, and the guy who probably single-handedly kills jazz, is Louis Jordan. And if you look at the charts from the end of the war into the mid-early 50s, Louis Jordan owns them. He has number one after number one after number one. I believe some of them crossed over into the pop charts as well, but the R&B race record charts, Louis Jordan owns it. And this is jazz grafting itself with the blues into rhythm and blues. The beat, the swing gets very straightened out. The words, the vocalizations become an important part with these Louis Jordan tracks. And they're super black in their experience. You won't even understand half these titles if you ain't black. You know, especially in 1946. Choo Choo Chiboogie. Don't let the devil catch you crying. I'm gonna move to the outskirts of town. Salt Pork, West Virginia. Ain't nobody here but us chickens. It's very much a youthful, it's party music. And you went into black dance halls in the late 40s and early 50s. Louis Jordan has hit after hit and the black community was buying 45s. They don't really buy LPs as the LP era dawns. It's not a firm and fast rule, but for the most part, black consumers bought 45s or listened to the radio and went down to their local nightclub, dance hall, social club, and heard the jukebox playing the 45s. They didn't really buy albums nearly as much. And being 10 to 13% of the population, of course, even if they were, it would still be a minuscule number. And so Jordan comes along, and boy, the young black community just loves it. And of course, young white kids were hearing it as well. But it's hard for us jazz heads to recognize, because we're so familiar with Miles and Monk and Coltrane and all these jazz artists that we think of as being hierarchical. And most of us aren't that familiar with Louis Jordan today. But in the 40s and 50s, this guy was it. And all those great jazz artists that we speak of all the time were incredibly marginalized. And for the most part, it's whites that were buying Thelonious Monk albums in 10 inches. As the 10-inch era dawns, it's a different format that allows you to program and produce a record session differently. And music that was meant for albums didn't hit jukeboxes the same way. And those jukebox edits are 2-3 minutes long. It changes the demographic of the buying public a lot. And again, Louis Jordan shakes things up so dramatically. And it's kind of weird we don't know more about him today, because the link between him and where the black audience is very strong. And it's his magnetism that pulls the black consumer and the black listener and the black dancer away from the swing halls and the swing bands and the Tommy Dorseys and even the Count Basies. And it's now this. And this is even a lot of great jazz musicians at the time saying he single-handedly killed jazz. Because instead of having to have a 14, 17, 18-piece big band, he was now a 5-piece, maybe a 6-piece. Piano, drums, guitar, him on a sax singing, maybe a trumpet player. It was a very scaled down enterprise. And the room was left for the vocal to take a predominant role. It wasn't no longer just the vocal's going to get a place in the song, but the trumpet player's also going to have a 16 bars, and the sax player's going to have 16 bars. It was now the one's first, second, third verse with the vocals. And the horn players had to fit in little spaces in between the words. And so it changes and shuffles the listener's priorities. And so now long suites on jazz records that were instrumental, where Coltrane was going off for 64 bars, that wasn't going to catch the young black kid at all. And it's important to always remember, it's what young black kids are listening to that young white America is always going to be like, what's that? Ooh, my dad kind of pissed me off this week. Bet I could bug the shit out of him if I brought that record home. You know what I'm saying? Me as a preacher's kid, I knew all about that. Motley Crue, Metallica, yeah, my dad ain't gonna like that. And so white American kids have always wanted to kind of rebel against what their parents were about. And Pat Boone wasn't gonna cut it for some of these guys. They weren't gonna be down with Burl Ives all day long. They wanted something a little different. And what ends up happening is Louis Jordan sets the stage, and the black audience goes to that venue, and the black listener pretty much follows that part of the tree. That becomes the main trunk. Even though jazz is the main trunk down here in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, into the 40s and 50s, the rhythm and blues takes over that audience, and jazz itself becomes an offspring of itself. And so that new branch, now with its diminished audience and its more self-indulgent and better educated younger generation, is going to branch itself into 20 new branches, but they're all off the main trunk. And so that means every one of these great labels I talk about, every one of the great jazz musicians from the 50s and 60s are no longer on the main trunk of the black tree. They're now on this diminished branch with a much smaller audience that rarely broke through to make a dent commercially. And the labels like Blue Note and Prestige, that never happens. Those guys never break through and have hits. Sidewinder does in 63, 62 cross and have some success on the R&B charts, but that's the exceptions. And it took Blue Note doing the Boogaloo thing, which was very much rooted in rhythm and blues, for that to happen. And there are moments where jazz does get into the jukebox again. There's some Horace Silver, some Lee Morgan, some Jazz Messenger stuff that would have had edited 7-inch versions that got into jukeboxes on some of those labels. And then soul jazz was really the last time that jazz records sold fairly well. Jack McDuff, Jimmy Smith, some of that 60s organ, Grant Green, those records would sell okay, but they weren't touching what was happening around the rest of the music landscape. And what's also important to remember is that this is a business. So what you have is even the great jazz labels starting to conform to the demand of the consumers. And so great labels like Atlantic and Chess switch their focus to the point of where jazz becomes a very diminished afterthought. It allows the restrictions on what you can do in jazz to be almost lifted. Because at best you're going to sell 40,000 copies of that. Do what you want. The commercial expectation wasn't there. So the concern about don't fuck this up, don't make a record that's not going to sell, it's not going to sell anyway. So do what you want. And Pithecanthropus erectus, Giant Steps, records like that at Atlantic Records is an Atlantic record label saying jazz is already being marginalized. We see that. So we're going to let it do what it wants to do, but rhythm and blues is going to be where we focus. I'm going to show you a lot of the stuff that takes the black audience from the great Louis Jordan and his Timpani 5. And he talks about fat chicks, he talks about getting drunk, he talks about eating fat and gravy and biscuits and fish fries. It's just such a black experience. And this is what you would hear. The people who partied to Fats Waller in the 20s, those age kids in the 40s were partying to Louis Jordan. And there's actually some crossover there. Waller has a lot of that same black lingo in a lot of what he was talking about. So anyway, let's dig into some of the stuff that really leads jazz down a bottomless pit. And again, this is a lot of why I say jazz isn't a live form anymore. It lost its audience when it lost its black audience. And that means the white audience was no longer interested in necessarily fun with what those jazz records were doing, and the marginalization of the jazz consumer becomes in full effect post 1950. Jazz is such an afterthought commercially at that point. And so we're going to first look at Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters has been around making, early recordings, but when Chess starts focusing on putting this stuff out, the black consumer and the white consumer is like, oh, okay, I see, I hear, what's that about? John Lee Hooker, he comes along, and he's got that just great storytelling vibe that's not that different from a Ben Webster or an Illinois Jack Kent, in the sense of him sitting down and telling you on his knee something. Bo Diddley comes along, and the shuffle and the groove of his rhythm and blues was magnetic. A very important step is Chuck Berry. And when Chuck Berry comes along, it's really the introduction to rock and roll. And this is what leads us in the not too distant future to all the rock and roll and blues that we know of and think of today. Little Richard was right there in the shadows of Chuck Berry. Maybe not even the shadows, he was probably just as prominent. But white listeners were hearing this black music now. And these 45s and even some of these LPs were selling in the black community and in the white community. And it leads to Fats Domino, Jerry Lee Lewis. Now there's a white guy doing black rhythm and blues. And then of course, Elvis. Elvis is this incredible moment when all the music of the black blues and rhythm and blues becomes codified by a white man. That's marketable. That's the Beastie Boys. That's Eminem. That's infinite examples of a white guy learning to do black things very well. And suddenly now, the rebellious youth could bring home Fats Domino and Chuck Berry, but now all kids could bring home an Elvis record. And Mom and Dad still didn't like it, because it was still so sexual. It was still so overt in its nature and its tendency to be sexual. It made a lot of people very uncomfortable, but it doesn't change any of the facts. And so, out of that one Louis Jordan brand trunk springs the blues of the 50s and 60s into rock and roll. And a huge chunk of the listener goes that way. And of course, the other huge development at that point is directly in the shadow of Louis Jordan. Come the early 50s is the great and super talented Ray Charles. And Ray Charles is that next nail in the coffin. Because white America is now listening to Elvis and firmly loving that blues-rooted rock and roll. And the black America is hearing for the first time that. And Brother Ray, he grasps jazz and the blues and soul and gospel and codifies what soul music is. And Ray is capable of doing very jazzy, dominating instrumental records, and he does numerous ones of that. But Ray also was a great singer, a great personality, just magnanimous. And Ray Charles is this huge, again, crossing of the Red Sea. You know what I mean? It's bringing the people forward to another new promised land. And what Jordan was in the 40s and early 50s, Ray Charles codifies it even further and actually kind of separates it even more from the jazz roots that Louis Jordan still had in his stuff. And there's a lot of Ray stuff with a lot of jazz in it, but a lot of blues, soul, and gospel permeates all of it as well. Even the swing of that, it has a bit of a hard driving swing to it, but it's super danceable. And all of a sudden with Monk and Parker and Max Roach and Young Miles, all that stuff, it's not having the impact. It's just not part of the landscape. And Brother Ray, I have probably 30 of his records, but Atlantic Records, who is one of the great jazz labels of the early to mid 50s. By the time these Ray Charles records have come out into 56, 57, 58, it just shakes the foundation of the music industry. And it also propels Atlantic Records from being a jazz label with a fairly small demographic into being one of the giants of the industry. Atlantic's ascendancy is incredible, and Ray Charles is a big part of that. We're going to see more from Atlantic here in a second. I want to cover a few other artists. Sam Cooke comes along, and he's a wonderful, just beautiful gospel, soaked balladeer, a very soft soul kind of approach to the music, who came to a tragic end. That's another collection of his. Johnny Nash is a great singer. He's crossing over rhythm and blues, sounds of the island. He's really grafting and having a big impact as well. The Drifters had a lot of big hits, and it's almost easy listening to today's listener, but this was early R&B. And Little Anthony and the Imperials, kind of almost a bubblegum doo-wop type of R&B. This was now what the kids were excited about. And then, so the Great Atlantic Records, not just Ray Charles. Aretha Franklin comes along and sets the soul world on fire. Wilson Pickett makes a number of incredible records that the black listeners loved and the white listeners followed. Otis Redding, again, another Atlantic superstar that just changes the face. Sam and Dave, these guys were Memphis Soul. Solomon Burke. There's just a lot of great examples of Atlantic Records saying, you know what, we still love jazz, we're going to still record it, but we know that 1200 series, that's a thing of the past. This 8000 series is going to be what makes our money. And I'm guessing, even by finding titles, that the average 8000 title in the late 50s, early 60s probably had 5 times the distribution and volume of copies as the 1200 series jazz stuff does. It's pretty different how often you see those records. So Ray Charles has this huge impact. Atlantic's changing the face. Not only is Chess Records, which is affiliated with Argo and the Chicago jazz sound, Chess is now doing R&B stuff like the Dells. And so they're doing the great blues things with John Lee Hooker and Muddy Waters and Sonny Boy Williamson and Little Walter, but they're also delving into that new soul sound. And the white audience is just loving it. Another great Atlantic group, which I should have had in the last section, Archie Bell and the Drells. Tighten Up, Soulfinger, they had some great songs back in that era that were just transforming what people listen to. And then a guy who changes the face of pop forever in R&B is James Brown. And he's one of those fulcrum points that all the soul, jazz, rhythm and blues before him, he somehow digests it and condenses it down into this new form. And so much of what happens in R&B, funk, hip-hop, and even rock after James Brown, he's a big part of. You can't hear the Red Hot Chili Peppers give it away, and not hear the funk and Chad Smith and Flea that is driven by James Brown and his great groups. And James Brown I've seen personally him talk about how he saw Louis Jordan as a young kid. And Louis Jordan changed young James Brown's mind about who he was going to be. The Isley Brothers come along with even major label stuff like Shout, which we all kind of know. It's Your Thing, which is a classic. And they even had some stuff on Motown Tamla. Isley Brothers were a huge part of the black community. And I can tell you from DJing in the black community for 15, 20 years that when you start getting into Ray Charles forward, that's what the 40 to 60, 70-year-old black audience who goes out on a Friday night to have a drink and dance and socialize, that's where it starts for them. And jazz to them isn't any of the jazz that we think of as jazz. It's Ray Charles, it's Grover Washington, it's George Benson, it's not Thelonious Monk, it's not Miles Davis. It's an interesting diversion that I think a lot of us lose a lot of sight of. And then the Impressions come along with Curtis Mayfield. Young Jerry Butler's in the group, I believe, at a point. They had some amazing records, the Impressions. And of course, Curtis Mayfield goes on in the 70s to do some of the greatest soul funk records of all time. That's just a collection right there. Jerry Butler has a lot of great soul songs. The Meters, who represent that Dixie, New Orleans funk, were a very important group. Booker T and the MGs, the group at Stax, Volt, Roadrunner by Junior Walker and his All-Stars. Junior Walker was a Texas tenorman, so he's got a lot of jazz roots in him. But this is what jazz has done. Jazz, like it always has, black music like it always has moved forward. And what's left is a very minimalized jazz audience that, again, I don't think today we see it that way. I don't think we grasp it. And then the next thing that happens in the early 60s is Motown. And Motown was incredibly popular. And it made a very safe, white soul music that blacks could dance to and love and buy, but whites felt comfortable with the Four Tops. They felt comfortable with the Temptations. And the production was incredible. The vocals were always on point. The grooves were always sensational. The looks, the content, it was all made sure to make sure that white America didn't feel too uncomfortable with the Supremes and Diana Ross, Supremes of Liverpool, Heat Wave, Martha and the Vandellas, More Martha, Gladys Knight and the Pips, who I'm a big Gladys Knight fan. Their best stuff was actually on ABC later on. Mary Wells, My Guy, Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, more Marvin Gaye with his girls, Stevie Wonder early stuff. Stevie has a lot of great records in the early. Uptight's a great song. Down to Earth. A lot of these Stevie Wonder records are tough to find. On the Beach, good luck finding that record. The Jazz Still, a little Stevie Wonder. So it's these guys that come along and start just dominating R&B charts. And in the case of Motown, and even a lot of that Atlantic stuff, it's absolutely crossing over into the pop charts. And so all these great danceable records are happening, and jazz is still left kind of in its own ashes. And it's amazing how much great music was still made by an art form that was kind of being abandoned. As the 70s come along, new acts like the Shy-Lights come along, who make some of the great soul records. The Dramatics, who have a half dozen just incredible songs that were massive hits. Isaac Hayes, who was a writer for Stax and Volt, he comes along. Records like Black Moses and Hot Buttered Soul, they were revolutionary sounding records and changed the trajectory of everybody involved with the music. The Staple Singers come along with that great LA sound and that kind of gospel inflected, real part of the evangelical movement church, and socially conscious. Respect yourself. I'll take you there. Just fantastic songs. The band War, again, borrows a lot from jazz. Some more projects than others. But here they're playing with Eric Burden, the great British rhythm and blues star, who was a big thing in the 60s, playing from a British perspective, black blues music, rhythm and blues music. And we forget just how big some of those records were. Dance to the Music, Sly Stone, this was a real pivotal moment. Kool and the Gang. People forget that the early Kool and the Gang was fairly instrumental and very much rooted in jazz. And then as the 70s dawned, the full force of civil rights has liberated the black singer. And so what was being said in code by the Lee Morgans and Hank Mobleys and John Coltrane's, suddenly Curtis Mayfield could openly say that. Marvin Gaye makes one of the great records of all time. Let's Get It On is just a brilliant record. Stevie Wonder makes 4 records in a row. I don't think I found Intervisions, but Talking Book, Intervisions, Songs in the Key of Life. These are super important, seminal moments in black culture. And all of this, in its sum total, is what killed jazz music. And jazz, in a desperate attempt to stay alive, tries a lot of different things. And they try to reconnect, but it just never really gets that young black audience back, which means the young white audience isn't coming back either, which means it's now a thing of the past. And it almost makes it more special in a way. It's like if you study Latin, do you need the validation of Latin still being a spoken language? Or is it almost cooler to say, I speak a dead language? I think the people who need jazz to be validated today as still being alive, just celebrate the fact that you're still remembering an art form that no longer is a current entity. And you're doing a great job reminding people of that great heritage. But I think it's silly to say something that doesn't even take up 1% of the marketplace to present or pretend like it's an alive current part of the music business. It's not. It's, again, that's just my view of all these things. Because I know how black audiences shape the consumer assumption of what white audiences do. And I know what blacks listen to and connected with. I've looked at the charts a lot over the years and got to know them. Like I said, soul jazz has some impact and has a few records here and there that sells pretty well. The bossa nova kind of is this moment where jazz has a bit of a commercial splash again. You know, and every once in a while a record would do really well. But for the most part here in America, rhythm and blues, soul music, the blues takes over the jukeboxes and radio shows, and jazz becomes this long form LP extrapolated ideations. We can now explore deeper into the art form, and those of us who are still allowed to record and have a contract, the liberty we now have because we're not expected to sell 1 million copies, it's kind of what creates the freedom to do a lot of the great things that happen in jazz as it's becoming an ember. You know, it's just really weird. And so in a lot of ways, the avant-garde is a kind of reaction to that spreading a diaspora of the black music. There's this freedom now to be unregulated, and the avant-garde is just kind of like this no rules now. And it doesn't matter because no one's buying and no one's listening. You know, it's like if you're a comedian telling jokes in an empty room, you can say whatever the fuck you want. And avant-garde was just that. There's no one listening to this. We're playing in front of 7 people. Everybody's at the Ray Charles show. That's the facts of it. So I think a lot of us in our mindsets, our perceptions of what jazz is and how important it was at the time and to who, it's all very kind of guided because of what we've elevated and what we hold in high esteem now. I think it totally misconstrues how things were at that time. And the Hank Mobleys just weren't on the radar, no matter how great they were. Even Coltrane and Impulse, it's a drizzle. It's a teardrop in a rainstorm. It's so under the current of everything else that's happening. And like I said, the average white consumer wants to see what the black kids are listening to so they know what they can go out and become hip with. And it's none of that's to diminish what jazz is and what it's still doing even. It's just the fact of the matter is it was killed by the next generation coming along wanting to have their own thing, which always has happened. You know, hip-hop wasn't good enough for today's kids, so they wanted trap music. It's the same principle at work. And now the guys who grew up with Pac and Biggie, they hear this trap music, like, that's not music. You know, that's not, it's just pretty much par for the course. So from Elvis to Ray Charles to the great Louis Jordan, it's all these factors. And then out of the blues and out of the great rock and roll explosion comes the Beatles and the Stones and then Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, and boy, but it all comes back to the roots of blues and jazz somehow. And it's pretty hard to grasp, I think, if you're a young music fan. You know, it's pretty hard to understand jazz's place in the 50s and 60s unless you've looked at a lot of charts and seen a lot of records. And just, like I said, if you doubt what I'm saying, look at the average store on Discogs. Look at the jazz titles from the 50s and 60s and look how much of it is white, kind of milky jazz. And that wasn't going to be enough for the average young black kid. It just wasn't. It wasn't enough for the average young white kid. A lot of it was garbage. And it's why there's so much jazz out there that's available for $1, $2, $3, $4, because most of it, no one wants it. And it's also why the black jazz records have become so rare and valuable, because everybody wants them and they didn't sell well. So, soul music in a nutshell, but primarily Louis Jordan. He's the guy that killed jazz. And like I said, I saw a lot of great jazz musicians saying, this guy, when he shrunk the size of the band down, that has financial ramifications. When you're paying 15, 18 guys, you're splitting that money a lot of ways. It's tough to make a living as jazz becomes more and more diminished in the 50s with a big band. Louis paying 5 other guys. And Louis Jordan, in a lot of ways, is as impactful and as big a presence in the black community and as important as Louis Armstrong. And he just doesn't have any of the audience today who are out there promoting what he did and what he does. But Jordan's a lot of fun. And I buy his collections when I find them. They're mostly from pre-LP era. So it's going to be 78s compiled from different labels. Stuff gets bought under different labels as they consolidate. And so some label will end up with some sessions from here and some sessions from there. And they'll reissue him as an MCA Louis Jordan record in 1980. But that's not where it's from. It's from the 1940s, early 50s. And it's just an important thing to grasp, I think. And it's also kind of interesting to see how much the creativity of jazz was loosened and allowed to be, so all these incredible variant sounds could exist, in large part because the format was dying, and so no one really cared. We know we signed you for 4 more records. We'll be lucky if you sell 40,000 copies of the 4 combined. You're such an afterthought to me at this point. I don't really care what you make. Just record it, we'll put it out, so we can be done with you. And more jazz cats, black and white, had a tougher time getting record deals. And it's, for every Miles Davis who makes it onto Columbia, most of them end up teaching dead, especially the black guys. And I've told you before, a lot of the white guys end up in Hollywood studios and television studios, the big bands at the late night shows. A lot of the great white jazz cats end up in those type of places. But the outcome for the black jazz musician wasn't nearly as rosy, sadly. But by the time the 1960s gets into full swing, no one's hiring big bands to do their parties anymore. So there's no one making money in jazz by that time. Now disc jockeys are starting to have a prevalent play. You're going to hire an R&B band before you hire a jazz band. And the R&B band's probably going to be cheaper because there's only 4 guys. And they can play the blues, they can play Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and Willie Dixon, and people will be fine dance to it. And so, who killed jazz? Louis Jordan. Louis Jordan killed it. And congrats to him. You know, because nothing ever stays static, nothing ever stays the same. And it's that death of jazz that allows it to become a butterfly and to really become, from bebop to the avant-garde, this incredibly varied landscape for roughly a decade and a half. And then the final nails are in the coffin by 1970. And there's still great jazz being made. And there's actually some stuff that's pretty commercial. You know, some of the ECM Keith Jarrett stuff, I guess, sold really well in Europe and even in America to some degree. But to me, that music has a whole lot different message to it than what a Lockjaw Eddie Davis record has to say from 1956. So anyway, I like my gut bucket. I like to feel the soul of what a musician's saying to me. I don't want to sit back and listen to how great a virtuoso you are. That's not really intriguing to me. I've heard virtuosity, and rarely does it pique my interest. For every Eddie Van Halen eruption where you're like, there's oodles of guys noodling themselves away where I'm like, oh, when's the guitar solo going to be over? For fuck's sake, he just goes on and on. You're not that interesting. You're not John Coltrane. You know, he's like the only guy that can go on for 6 minutes on a solo and you're still going. Most other guys, you've stopped listening. But Coltrane has this compulsory motive in what he's doing that's so electric. And again, none of it probably happens if jazz stays the mainstream. It was that rebellion against the Dorseys and the white all the white musicians that were all doing so well. Parker and Gillespie and Max and all, they're like, I don't want to just play schlocky Broadway songs for a white audience in Midtown. Let's go up to Harlem and play for a black audience or white cats who are adventurous and push the music beyond the boundaries. And I'm sure a lot of audiences who saw bebop didn't know what to make of it. A lot of jazz musicians themselves didn't know what to make of it. I listened to Hendrix, what's his name, John Hendrix, talk about when he first heard bebop. It took him a while to figure it out, you know, and that's part of the deal. And again, hard bop has some success, but very minimal. And soul jazz has some success, but it's very minimal. And even though there's some guys out there today who are selling some records in all their glory, you know, the Medeski, Martins, and Woods, and even the Saint Germain, that record was fairly popular, but that record doesn't have the soul of jazz. You know, it doesn't have the freedom, the movement. It was very rigid because of all the sampling. But all that modern jazz, I'm sure a lot of it's great. I'm sure a lot of it is. And I'll probably get to some of it as my money situation changes. But for now, I'm just stuck in the 50s and 60s. That's what it is. And so cheers to Louis Jordan. Cheers to Ray Charles. Cheers to all that great soul music. Cheers to Jerry Wexler and the Erdogan Brothers at Atlantic, hearing it and getting it. And then also allowing the Coltranes and Mingus's and Ornette Coleman's to open the doors to say, you guys do whatever you want. We know you're great players. Make the music you want to make. We don't really care. You know, you guys are great players. You're great talent. We understand what you guys are doing to some level. Do what you want to do. But we know that you're not going to be what we're relying on keeping the doors open with. We got Ray Charles for that. We got Wilson Pickett and Aretha Franklin and a ton of Otis Redding and a ton of other artists that were going to change forever how black music sounded and what white people were going to care about. My name's Dan. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Y'all stay safe. And in spite of the death of jazz, it does have a rebirth here. And that's all of us collecting it and honoring it and holding it in such high esteem like we all do. And it's noble and it's important, and it's as important a moment as Jackie Robinson crossing the color barrier in baseball. Jazz brings people together. It unified parts of America that never had that opportunity. And remember, there's an engine that does a lot to try to keep us apart. But that doesn't mean that the people themselves aren't trying to heal. If we could turn our televisions off, it probably would happen. Peace.